Okay, welcome. So just for next week, we're going to have Hillary Hoynes, and she's going to be talking about experimental evidence on the distributional impacts of Head Start. And today it's a pleasure to welcome Leila Boustan. She's an associate professor of economics at UCLA. Her work is at the intersection of economic history, labor economics, and urban economics. And a lot of her work is focused on the Great Black Migration from the rural South during and after World War II, as well as on the mass migration from Europe to the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today she's going to talk about her book project, Competition in the Promised Land, Black Migrants in Northeastern Cities and Labor Markets. So welcome, Lee.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to share with you all the outcome of what's been over a decade of work on the Great Black Migration, which started in Jeff Williamson's first year class in grad school. So I'm happy to have Jeff here. And this is a book that is in progress, almost done, but there's still time for edits at this point, so I'm happy to hear any of your comments and questions. And the main focus of the book is on the consequences of the Great Black Migration for the receiving areas in the North and West, for the labor markets, both black and white workers, and for urban space in cities and suburbs. But there is also a section of the book on the migrants themselves and how the costs and benefits of the migration compare. Hopefully this book will reach an audience of economists and economic historians, but also reach out to sociologists and urban planning and related fields. So I'm excited to be able to present in an interdisciplinary setting like this one. Let me start by giving you some facts about the Great Black Migration, which is one of the largest demographic episodes in US history. Over the course of the migration, 7 million blacks left the rural South to move to primarily industrial cities in the North and West, with the majority of this migration taking place in the decades of World War II and after. So these are new estimates that I've put together for the book on decadal flows of blacks from the South to the rest of the country, and then from the rest of the country to the South. And so for those of you who work with US Census data, you know that there are not direct questions on internal migration, so these have to be, these are estimates that are inferred from cohort counts. As you can see, the migration takes off around World War I, and that first wave of the migration in World War I in the 1920s has received the bulk of the attention in history. Perhaps because this was the first migration flow, and so it was very salient on the part of the receiving cities to have, for the first time, large black populations. But quantitatively, the wave of migration during World War II and after was much larger and quantitatively had potentially larger impacts on labor markets and housing markets. You see a drop-off in the migration during the Great Depression decade, and this follows, though it is also a bit more accentuated, national mobility trends, where national mobility was at its nadir during the Great Depression decade. And then, more recently, black migration to the South. I wouldn't say back to the South, because these are not necessarily return migrants who moved at some point early in life and are going back in retirement. These might be the second or third generation. But black migration to the South has picked up, so that in the 90s and 2000s and continuing in the most recent 10, 15-year period, the net black migration flow is towards the South. And again, this is part of a national trend of Sun Belt migration, but it's larger in scope, so that the black migration rates to the South are higher than the rates for other groups. My motivation in thinking about the consequences of this migration was looking at the regional patterns of black income growth and relative black income growth, black relative to white, in the South and in the rest of the country, which I'll often refer to as the North, but includes the Western states. And this was motivated in part by looking at Heckman's work on this topic that Jim and I were talking about earlier today. So what you see here, and the labels are very small, so you wouldn't be able to see in the back certainly, or even in the front row, are log earnings for the median black worker, white worker, males, without restriction on full-time work during the year. These are medians. For black workers in the gray dots and white workers in the darker dots, outside of the South and in the South. And I think we can focus our attention on the black-white wage gap in log terms. So what you can see here is that the black-white wage levels and also the black-white wage levels are higher, the black wage levels are higher outside of the South in 1940, and the black-white wage gap is much smaller. So this would provide a motivation for migration. Leaving the South and moving to the North would increase black earnings in absolute terms and would reduce their gap relative to whites in the area. But then moving forward from 1940 to today, the vast majority of increases in black earnings, both in absolute and relative terms, have taken place in the South. So my focus in the book is primarily from 1940 to 1970, though this pattern has continued to the present. From 40 to 70, you see almost a full log point of improvement, 100 log points of improvement in black relative to white earnings in the South. But you see very little improvement, around 10 log points in the North. And by 1980, the entirety of that improvement had reversed. So if you go 40 to 80, you see essentially no improvement in black relative earnings outside of the South. So my question that motivated the beginnings of this work was, what is going on in the North? There's many explanations for what's going on in the South. Primarily, the focus has been on improvements in black education, quality and quantity. But what's going on in the North? Why haven't blacks been able to increase their absolute and relative earnings at a faster pace in northern cities? This is a question that's been asked quite a lot, and the focus has been on the demand side, I would say. So the existing stories for slow black economic progress in the North come primarily from the decline in the manufacturing sector. And the implicit comparison is often with earlier waves of migrants that came to the same cities from European countries. So implicitly, the comparison is Southern and Eastern European migrants who came to these same set of cities, let's say in the year 1900, many of whom were illiterate. Maybe their skill level was a little higher than the skill level of the average black migrant, but the comparison is not too off. And within a generation, or certainly two, there was substantial convergence between Southern and Eastern European migrants and existing white native workers. Then a generation goes by and blacks move to the same sets of cities. They arrive in the 40s and 50s. And so the argument has been that they arrive sort of at the wrong place at the wrong time. They may have enjoyed a decade or so of strong manufacturing employment and growth, but within a few years, manufacturing demand starts to soften. And on top of that, blacks may have faced additional barriers coming from northern racism, so that the comparison between Southern and Eastern Europeans and black migrants may not be exact. And so while blacks may have thought that they were escaping a more obvious form of Southern racism in Southern labor markets, they arrived in northern cities where they may be the last to be hired or the first to be fired. They may only have access to certain types of occupations and not others. And so the combination of these two forces, general decline in demand for low-skilled work, and then specific declines or low levels of demand for black workers in particular, combine to prevent more rapid black economic advancement. And what I want to add to that story is the supply side. So not only may blacks have been facing slow manufacturing growth or declines in manufacturing employment, and not only may they be facing specific barriers in the labor market, but they were doing so alongside a growth in competing labor supply coming from the South, so that the black labor force in the North and West doubles over this 30-year period. And depending on the nature of competition in northern markets, and that's something we would have to look at empirically, it could be that existing black workers or the first wave of new migrants in the 40s were particularly competitive with the new arrivals. So even a white worker with a similar degree of skill may have faced less competition with black workers because of the way that labor markets are set up. So that is the first thing that I started to look at. And then I extended beyond that to think about other sources of competition. So the name of the book is Competition in the Promised Land, competition that goes on within labor markets, but also that might be going on within housing markets. So ultimately what I'll show you today is that similarly skilled white workers did not face very much competition from these black arrivals. In fact, the competition was concentrated from black workers. But in the housing market, whites and blacks did compete over housing units that were on the border and the transition areas between traditional black neighborhoods and neighboring white neighborhoods. And given that blacks had a small set of neighborhoods to which they had access at the time, oftentimes blacks outbid whites for that housing on the border area, on the transition between the two types of neighborhoods. And we'll see that black inflows to cities were one of the important causes of white suburbanization at the time, or the white response, I should say, to black migration was one of the important causes. Now that's in the context of many other changing forces in the 40s and 50s that encouraged city residents to move to suburbs. So I want to take time to pin down how relevant is this factor relative to others. So today I'm going to talk about the two consequences of the black migration that I outlined, labor market competition, and the role of black migration as a cause of white suburbanization. But I also want to start by considering the benefit of the migration to the migrants themselves, so that ultimately, together, this will provide 2 out of the 3 components of giving a full accounting of how the migration changed the US economy. The migrants themselves benefit, there are costs on the receiving areas that the book will outline, and then there are also indirect potential benefits to the South, or costs to the South, of losing a large share of the black workforce and the black population, which is beyond the scope of what I'm doing here. I'm motivated here by the relative black advancement in northern cities, and what remains to be done is thinking about these indirect benefits on the South. So I'm going to start by thinking about the migrants themselves, and that's actually the area that has already been walked many times before I arrived in this research area. So going back to contemporary observers of the migration, the focus in economics and then later in economic history has been on what is the benefit of moving from a low-wage agricultural southern region to the high-wage northern industrial cities. Starting with contemporary observers in the 19-teens and 20s in that first wave of migration, including many early black economists. But what I'll highlight here is Gunnar Myrdal, who traveled in the South in the late 1930s and then published his massive volume, An American Dilemma, in 1944. And his focus was, in general, on the Black economic and social condition in the South and trying to sort of publicize what he thought Northerners may not understand about what the Southern condition was like. And in that book, he predicted that migration to the North and West would be a tremendous force of improvement for Black economic conditions. 40 years later, Smith and Welch, two economists, go back and reanalyze Myrdal's prediction. How important is migration from this low-wage to high-wage area in overall Black economic advancement? I highlighted for you relative Black-white wage gaps in the North and in the South, but I didn't show you the national Black-white wage gaps. So the overall decline in national Black-white wage gaps would be coming from regional patterns, but also from interregional migration. And they find that migration can explain 20% of national Black-white earnings convergence. So depending on, the eye of the beholder, that's either large or small, basically the vast majority of improvement is they attribute to education, but the remainder they attribute to migration. So that is the sort of the state of the literature on what we know about the role of migration in national Black-white wage improvement. So what I want to do is provide some micro-estimates of the return to migration for the migrants themselves, rather than doing a decomposition a la Smith and Welch. And in order to do that, I first, before I think about the return to migration, need to think about migrant selection. Because if you don't think about who moved, and you simply do a naive comparison in the earnings of migrants that we now see in the North and those who choose to stay in the South, we may end up combining a true return to migration with a selection term. If migrants are positively selected and they come from the best and the brightest of the Southern population, maybe they would end up earning a lot anyway, even if they stayed in the South. And the existing literature on migrant selection in this context has argued for a very long time that migrants are positively selected. That particularly the focus has been looking at the education variable in the census. And that Black migrants have on average around 2 years more education than Black stayers. So of course, with some return to migration, with some return to education, they're going to earn more. Now, that's quite possible that there's positive selection, but there are some concerns with using the education variable to measure selection here. I think the most important concern is how census enumerators in the North and in the South treated the years of education variable. In the North, most students were in graded schools already. And so when asked, how many years have you been in school? A grade is a grade, and if you've been in school, up through 7th grade, that would be something that they would understand. In the South, and particularly for Blacks, many Blacks were in ungraded schoolhouses at the time. So they may have been sitting in school until they were 14, but that doesn't mean they were up to an 8th grade level. If you look at Black migrants in the North, they are disproportionately clustered at that 8th grade year. Not that many say they went to 7th grade or 6th grade or 9th grade. They're very concentrated in that 8th grade year, which suggests there may be some issues of misreporting. There are other concerns with thinking about selection this way as well. So what I wanted to do is come up with an alternative measure of selection that might be more informative here. And the reason why I was skeptical of the sort of uniform findings of positive selection is intuition that come from the Roy model, sort of the workhorse model in thinking about migrant selection. So the Roy model suggests that if migrants are leaving an unequal sending place, like the South was at the time, and if you look at the income distribution in the South, either overall or specifically within black workers, you see that the South was far more unequal than the North. So if you have migrants leaving an unequal sending place and going to an equal one, you actually expect negative selection. Now, there can be many other things that migrants think about beyond just the earnings that they might achieve in the new place. There may be additional costs that low-skilled migrants have to face that they aren't able to save up for the trip and so on. So there's a lot of reasons why the basic prediction may not hold in the data. But the simple prediction seemed quite at odds with what people were finding in terms of selection within the black community. And also at odds with the fact that the black outmigration rate from the South was much higher than the white outmigration rate from the South. And if we just think blacks on average are much lower skilled than whites at the time, that's negative selection there across race, but within race, it looks like there was a lot of positive selection. So what I end up finding is a bit different, a modification on what people see in the education data. I match migrants and non-migrants from the 1940 census back to their childhood household in 1920. So yesterday in the economics department seminar, I talked about other sorts of matching data sets. So this is something that I've used in other contexts. But here we can observe that someone's a migrant because they report their place of birth as a southern state, but their current state of residence is in the north. The non-migrants are those who remain within the South. And then we observe them in their childhood household in 1920, with the matching going on by first name, last name, age, and state of birth. And we can observe the occupations of their fathers. So this is all pre-migration, a pre-migration outcome, whereas education could be jointly determined with the decision to migrate. This is an outcome that was determined before any of this migration took place. And what we see is that migrants come from the high end of the father's occupational distribution, which is consistent with this positive selection, but also from the very low end. They don't come from the middle. So let me show you what those results look like. These are occupational distributions for fathers of non-migrant sons, who in 1940 we see they still live in the South, and migrant sons at the household level. So if the household has at least one migrant son in the household, we put him into this right-hand category. And if you add up across all of these categories, you get to 100. So these are all of the potential father categories. And then I've lumped them into high-skilled, middle-skilled, and low-skilled. So you see that households with at least one migrant son are concentrated at the high level and at the low level. So they're disproportionately likely to be in this high-skilled category, 26% versus 20%, and at this low level, 40 versus 35. And the differential is coming from the middle. Who are these high-skilled guys? They're farm owners. So they actually own land. It's around 15% of the black population. White-collar workers or skilled blue-collar workers. Within each one of these skill categories, you see interesting selection patterns as well. Within each category, it would be the fathers who have skills that are transferable to the north that are more likely to send migrants. So within this high-skilled category, you see that there's actually no differential between the households with and without migrants in the farm owners. The differential is coming from the white-collar and skilled blue-collar workers who are more likely to be able to pass on useful skills to their sons that would be useful in the north. So you see interesting selection patterns across these different skill groups and within them, far more than we can learn just from the education variable, given some concerns with how the education variable is coded and how it might be jointly determined with migration. Steve?
Why are you giving pride of place to economic motivations?
Right. So I think that the economic motivations and the simple Roy model predictions may explain why we're getting low-end selection here, but then it does not explain why we're getting high-end selection as well. And that can be coming from the benefit, the extent to which different groups place benefit on the social and political freedoms of the North. And it's consistent with what Jake Victor has found in some work that he's done on migrant selection from this episode, that he finds that people from the high skill categories place a higher premium on just specifically moving across the border into the north. So in terms of, distance is an important component and of how people make migration choices, and the high skilled are especially likely to flip over the border and get to the north. And so he gives that an interpretation of, well, there's a set of northern amenities that are specific to blacks at the time. You are much more likely to be able to vote, more likely to be therefore represented by a black politician, more likely to be able to walk into a restaurant or onto a bus and not be harassed or told to be sitting in a particular place, and that people from the high end of the skill spectrum place more weight on that.
I guess what's concerning me is regional heterogeneity. Suppose everybody moved because that the motivating factor is salience of racial violence. You just overlay that on your skill categories. It's not obvious to me where you get patterns like this.
Right, so that it could be sort of willingness to pay to avoid a given degree of racial violence. One thing that could be in mind for you, I'm not sure if this is what you were thinking, Steve, is whether the high skilled are particularly likely to be targeted. So if you see a given amount of lynching, for example, which is a component of racial violence that's well measured, and a lot of the other components that might be the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of other things below the surface. There's been a long-standing hypothesis in social science that the high-skilled blacks are more likely to be victimized than low-skilled blacks, and that it's sort of this idea of you're becoming uppity, and therefore, actually Stu Tolnay at Washington has done a lot of work on this, and recently matched lynching victims to their previous census returns to see occupations, and has not found any evidence of this kind of high status targeting. So it's possible, though. I mean, that's just maybe at the tip of the iceberg, that we don't see other things below the surface, that the high skilled felt particularly threatened by potentials for violence in the South, and so that might be another motivation. So I absolutely, in thinking about this, think that there's two sets of motivations, the economic and the social, and the economic explains why we actually are picking up some negative selection here, which no one has seen yet, but that the social might explain why we do have some high skill selection as well. And I don't believe that all of the education results are wrong either. I think some of them are artifacts of coding, but some of them are real, and they're picking up the sons of these guys here.
What is the direct evidence on the Roy model from this? So what is the return to skill higher in the South than it is in the North?
Yes. Overall and for
So
blacks.
but in this particular case, so if I compare the high skill to the mid skill, and compare the mid skill to the low skill.
With these categories.
I mean, the question is, you find direct evidence.
Right.
I mean, you might find that in the South, the payoff between low and mid is smaller, and the payoff between.
Yeah. It's a good question, and it's something, I can't do it for exactly this period because these are the fathers in 1920. 1940 is the first census that we have income information rather than just occupational information. And in 1940, we only have income information if you're wage and salary, which means farm owners and farm tenants, which you see are going to be, if you combine those two, that's going to be 50% of the labor force. We still won't have income information for those guys in 1940. So, you could do a little bit about skilled blue collar versus semi-skilled or something in 1940 to try to actually provide some direct evidence on that. I haven't looked at that. I've only looked in 1940 at the full income distribution rather than breaking it into these categories, but I could certainly and should do that.
Like return education too.
Yeah.
Return education higher in the South.
It is. And actually, Bill Collins has a paper in Jeff's Festrich volume on that point, return to education in the South being higher, and therefore you end up getting inflows of high-skilled workers to the South in this period from the rest of the country. Okay. So with these estimates in hand of selection, or with this sense of the selection patterns, selection here is bimodal. And so it's not clear what that will do for estimates of the return to migration. It could be that these two sources of selection will cancel out. And that is ultimately what I find. So actually, the naive estimates of return to migration here are not far off base. So I've gone through all these exercises to say they could be. Turns out that they're not. So here I have, again, I'm using this matching idea where I'm following pairs of brothers from the 1920 census forward to 1940. In some cases, both brothers stay in the South. In some cases, both of them move to the North. But in some cases, there's a mismatch where one brother stays and one brother goes. The nice thing here is that because I can match to 1940, given the privacy rules, it takes 72 years for census data to become de-anonymized. So 1940 is only recently available. And it's available in complete count. So it's been completely digitized for the entire population. Can put together large samples that way. And it's the first census with individual wage and salary earnings information for wage workers, not for the self-employed. So you have to do some imputations for the earnings of the self-employed. And here are my estimates of the return to migration. Using the full population in 1940, meaning no one's matched, I'm just comparing all blacks that I observe living in the North who were born in the South to all blacks who were born in the South and stay there, without any attempt to deal with selection. Then I do the same kind of OLS exercise in my matched sample to make sure that matching doesn't create any kind of odd biases. And then I include the household fixed effects, so I'm comparing brothers. As you can see, both for blacks and for whites, the household fixed effect doesn't matter. You get the same answer in terms of the magnitude of the returns. And the returns are large. So in log points, 80 log points for blacks, 50 log points for whites. So that's over 100% return increase in earnings from moving from south to north. This is around on par with estimates that Ron, my co-author, on some other work, and I have put together for European migration at the time. Both of these estimates are smaller than what people see today for returns from Mexico to the US.
How does the similarity affect your thinking about the sources of selection?
Say more about that?
Suppose I have two brothers, identical family backgrounds. One of them moved, the other didn't. One way to interpret that, that's the more ambitious person.
Oh, for sure.
There's no value. And presumably that person knew something about their own skills, et cetera. In other words, all that observed.
Oh, absolutely.
The fact that it doesn't seem to matter, in my mind, is suggestive that the reasons for migration may not be related to economic. Pushing a little too hard.
Could be. That might, right. No, absolutely. And so I should, what I'll just say in response to that question is that I should have been more precise in my language, that when I say that the white bars here are controlling for migrant selection, it's controlling for a component of migrant selection, which is selection across family background types. Yeah. And so clearly within pairs of brothers, the more ambitious brother could be the one who goes.
But the fact that isn't what's happening to me, it's the dog that did not bark. It might be worth thinking about why when you're doing these different corrections for selection, you're not getting dissimilar results.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, in both the black bars and the white bars, we could have that the more ambitious guys are moving. And so we perhaps looking within household doesn't address that issue at all. And if that's a very important issue of individual behavioral characteristics and what the returns of those characteristics are on the labor market, so far what I've done hasn't been able to address that. But to the extent that brothers are genetically related, and so a component of the individual characteristics will be shared between brothers, and given that shared component, I'm still not seeing anything with these household fixed effects. Maybe it's the dog that didn't bark. So I hadn't thought about it that way. So I should be more precise about that. Okay, So with these estimates in hand, we can come up with an aggregate value of migration to the migrants. We know how much on average a migrant earns due to his migration, and we know how many migrants there were, with the one caveat being that this is the return as of 1940. And given that the migration then proceeds and competition takes place in the north with these new migrant flows, and that migrants are leaving the south, and therefore labor supply for blacks is contracting in the south, forces of wage convergence will be going on from 40 onward. And so this could be sort of a high point to the return to migration, and if you were to measure this again in 1960, this return could be smaller. Until eventually, by the year 2010, and I didn't emphasize that in my earlier graphs, black earnings in the north and the south are now comparable. So eventually there's been complete wage convergence due to this migration process. But that caveat aside, we can take this estimate to the return to migration, combine it with the total number of migrants that left, and come up with some aggregate value of the benefits of migration to the migrants. So we have this economic return of leaving the South of 130% in nominal terms, or 50% in real terms if you try to make some adjustments for cost of living. We know that mean black earnings in the South was around $4,000 in today's dollars. So we can then say, well, how much more would the typical black worker earn if he were to move to the north? And then we can aggregate that across all the migrants who moved and get a benefit of the migration of around $4 billion in real terms for the 2 million migrants who moved between 1940 and 1970, 2 million male migrants. So I told you there were 4 million overall, and so I'm not doing anything here with the potential earnings gains for women. And my inability to focus on women here is primarily, there's all of the standard problems of doing, of looking at labor questions in women and selection into the labor force and so on, but there's also the matching problems here, that in order to match brothers, I follow them by first and last name. When women marry, they change their last name, and so we can't come up with estimates here for women. But for men, we get the real benefit of migration on aggregate of $4 billion in today's dollars in an annual flow. And then we can take that and compare that to the costs that I will estimate later on in the book, and I'll be turning to that now, in terms of competition forces in the north. So we can say, hey, was this migration a good deal or a bad deal for blacks as a whole rather than just for migrants? Answer is it's a good deal overall, but the costs in the north are going to bring down the value of this migration for the overall black population.
Hi, I'm just looking for a little clarification here. Can you go back a slide?
Sure.
So these are huge returns to migration. And my guess is that a part of the huge return is simply the north-south wage differential.
Yep.
Now, in that diagram, do you account for the average wage differential?
That's most of what's well, there's two things going on. There's a shift in occupational distribution from south to north, so that southerners are more likely to be in agricultural occupations. Yep. And regardless of what region you're in, manufacturing occupations pay more, and so if you have the opportunity to shift up the occupational distribution, then the other part is just within each occupation, earnings are a lot higher in the north. Right. Earnings are around, for whites, so I can't remember the number offhand for blacks, but for whites they're around 30% higher in the north. Okay, so you can compare that here to the returns for whites. Right. So around half of that return for whites is going to be the fact that within each occupation, earnings are higher, and around half is going to be upgrading up the occupational ladder. And perhaps the same is true for blacks, but I can't do that decomposition on my feet right now. And to me, that's part of the return to migration. Well, you move from a low wage to a high wage place.
Okay, so now go to your next slide.
Yep. Yep.
The next slide, you're taking account of standard of living.
Yep.
And so I'm I'm puzzled a little bit about how the north-south wage differential relates to the north-south standard of living.
Okay.
Because both of those are somehow captured in this estimate that you're giving.
In the nominal estimate. And then my real estimate will depend on how much you like the cost of living adjustment that I did, which I didn't describe,
That's where I'm
but
heading.
yeah. So what I did for cost of living is a bit quick and dirty. So if people have good ideas for improving it, I'm open to those. But what I did was, in the census data, we know rents, and we know from survey evidence the share of housing as total component of budget. So we can, from the rents, figure out the rent differential. And then I assume for the remainder of the budget that everyone's facing national prices. So, for food and so on. Now that might not be true in 1940. There could be some bifurcation or separation of markets, but it seems to me like the most important component of cost of living that has a regional that has regional differential is the cost of housing. And so that is how I do the correction there, and it does make a big difference, as you can see.
Yeah.
That a large component of what looks like a real, from the nominal side, what looks like a return to migration is coming from the fact that rents are around 200% higher in the north.
Okay, now, the tax burden, ceteris paribus, is also a lot lower in the south during this period than it was in the west. And that too
Could
is
be,
part of the
yeah.
cost of living.
I have not thought at all about that. That's a great, I wouldn't even know enough about it to say whether that's true, about the tax burden being higher or lower in certain places. I never thought about that, so don't know.
Well, if it's property
Don't know.
income taxes we're talking about, then.
That's into rents.
You can confront the ownership issue,
Mhm.
I suppose. But also going to be true with income tax.
I hadn't thought about that at
And
all.
sales.
Yeah, have not thought about that. So thank you for bringing that up.
I also had a question.
Yeah.
I appreciate that you don't have quite the necessary evidence to do it for women. You can't do it for men. But is there a qualitative literature that makes assertions about this for women? They're certainly moving.
It's a great question. There's very little that I've seen on women. Most people have punted on it. But if these selection components are the same for men and for women, and I see that selection corrections don't matter very much here, then I could go ahead and estimate the full population OLS for women and just say, look, this might not be exactly right, but at least we get more information here. So I could definitely do that. So subject to these caveats, we have an estimate in hand now for the benefits of migration to the migrants. So now I'm going to turn, and for the rest of the time, I think there's half an hour, we'll talk about the consequences of the migration in the north, in the receiving areas. So I'm going to start with the labor market consequences, and then we'll turn to the housing market and white flight. For the labor market consequences, I follow an approach that has become quite typical in the economics of immigration literature to think about the effects of foreign migrant arrivals on the wages of similarly skilled natives. And in that literature, people will divide the entire US into skill groups on the basis of education and experience cells, with the idea that if you use the geographic variation, well, natives could always leave Miami as Cubans arrive, LA as Mexicans arrive, and spread the cost of migration to other locations. But your skill cell is something that's predetermined, and there's probably more substitutability within a skill cell than across them. So I divide the northern and western economy into 40 skill cells on the basis of education and experience. And it turns out that how you think about education matters a lot. So I start out with just using the years of schooling, And I have sort of historically specific and relevant categories: elementary school, middle school, some high school grads, and some college and beyond. And then experience in 5-year intervals, looking at men again only here. And then I look at inflows of Southern Black and white migrants into these skill cells, and then the effect of those labor supply shifts on the wages of existing Black and white workers in the North, allowing there to be imperfect substitutability between Blacks and whites within a skill cell, so that it's not the case necessarily that Black arrivals into the high school grad category for young men is going to have the same effect on white and Black high school grad young men in the North, allowing the data to tell us how substitutable are Blacks and whites within group. And, yeah.
Can you think about it, I'm sorry to interrupt. but
Yeah, go ahead.
occupations? In other words, there could be some occupations where a white employer does not want a Black employee, there's sales in Chicago. Or in contrast in factory, there's no, maybe morale issue
Yep,
with
yep,
white
yep.
workers. So
I've thought about it that way, and I've divided things rather than into 5 education groups into 6 rather than 5 education groups into 6 occupational categories. Those occupational categories are quite broad. So sales and clerical would be one, and operative would be another. With the idea that there's some trade-off with going down to the more detailed level, because once you get to the more detailed level of occupation, there's more opportunity for occupational switching. If the benefit of this approach is that people are sort of stuck in their skill cell and there's very little you can do to avoid the competition, if you get down to narrow occupational categories, then there can be some switching that goes on. The results are actually quite comparable if you divide the data that way by occupation.
And for European immigrants, you need to know English, is that?
Yes, and so it turns out, so what I'll show you here is going to group all whites together. But there is reason to believe that Blacks were closer substitutes with foreign whites than with native whites. And if you divide the group that way, look only at foreign whites or look only at native whites, you find that very strongly in the data in this approach. And this actually gets to something I want to say about how you measure schooling. But let me first tell you, so I have the estimates here in sort of graphical form. And let me tell you a little bit about what they mean and how they compare to similar estimates from the contemporary literature. So here we have the implied effect of a 10% increase in migrant labor supply in your skill cell, where we have a 10% increase in Black labor supply in the black bars and in white labor supply in the gray bars. And now we have existing Black workers as the potential competitors and existing white workers. So you see that when Black migrants move in to your skill cell in the North, existing Black workers experience a large wage loss, but white workers have a small wage loss that's only marginally significant. And when white workers move in,
I'm sorry, what's the data? It's
1940 to 1970 census data, pooled.
What's the difference? The difference between 70 and
40 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 70. So we have 40 skill groups, and each one has 4 observations. And so we're living off of changes decadally. If whites move in, Blacks in the skill group have no effect. It has no effect on them. Whites in the skill group, they also have a small negative effect for white Southern migrants arriving. What you can back out from these estimates here, a couple questions, but let me finish, is an implied elasticity of substitution between Blacks and whites in a skill group. And the implied elasticity of substitution here is 8. Now, 8 doesn't mean very much unless you think about it in context compared to other similar studies. Today, when people do the same exercise, they compile 70 through 2000 census data and look at foreign-born and native-born within the skill cell. They find elasticities of substitution of 20. So that implies that Blacks and whites in the same skill cell in the northern economy around World War II were less substitutable than foreigners and natives in the same skill cell are today. But what happens if you redefine the education groups? And the reason why I do this is that a year of education in a southern black school is not comparable to a year of education in a northern school, in a very clear sense. On average, southern black schools were only in session half the year. So today we're used to the 180-day school year in public schools. In the typical southern state, a black school was in session 90 days. So you may go to school every year and continue to proceed, but then after you've gone through the 8th grade, you really only have a 4th grade education in terms of days, likely days of attendance. So I match people, given their state of birth and their cohort, birth cohort, to their school term length. And then given the years of schooling they report in the census, I figure out what is the likely days of attendance. So that means to be in the elementary category, you have 900 days of school attendance or less, and so on. That takes a lot of blacks and puts them into the lower skill groups. And when you redo the analysis that way, that's saying that there's different people who would be competing with blacks. And so it looks in that case like there's much more substitutability within skill group than I thought. And in fact, the implied elasticity is 25. Still statistically different from infinity. But
Most things are.
yeah, no, actually, I mean, no, seriously, in this case, it's, there are many cases where you cannot rule out perfect substitutability. And so there's actually debate in the literature right now about the native-born, foreign-born, about whether you really can rule out. So the estimates are around 20, but they're kind of imprecise. And okay, so what this means to me is that there's discrimination that's going on for blacks, but it's primarily going on in the southern schoolhouse rather than in the northern labor market. So the way we've thought about blacks being assigned to low-skilled jobs in factories, that they're only taking the position loading up the furnace or cutting the meat off of the cow that comes by rather than using a more complex machine, is that northern employers would not allow blacks to ascend into those positions. But what this suggests is that northern employers are actually responding, for the most part, to the inferences that they draw about the productivity level of these black migrants, given the level of schooling they actually did achieve in the South. And so, yes, there's discrimination going on because southern blacks had only 90 days of schooling on average a year. I mean, which is just, you know, it's criminal when you think about it, but that's where the discrimination is going on, is within the South, to the extent that migrants arrive with a certain level of sort of quality-weighted schooling. And so, when you look at foreign-born whites in this context here with years of schooling, you get much more comparability between foreign-born whites and blacks, much more substitutability than you get for the native-born whites. And that again has to do, I think, though I don't have the data to show this because I don't know the days of schooling in rural Italy and Poland, but my sense is that the reported years of schooling for foreign-born whites in 1940 or so in the census would be much closer in quality-weighted terms to the schooling that blacks would have received in the South than it would be to the northern school experience. Okay, so when you roll all of this together, I prefer to use the estimates that come from the years of schooling rather than the days of schooling, because this combines these two sources of potential segmentation, the school differentials and the employer assignments. So I take from that estimate that if black labor supply doubled in the North within the average skill cell, which is what happened for blacks, then wages would be estimated to decline by 10%. So our estimate was a 10% increase was a 1.5% decline in wages, and I just scale that up for the fact that black labor supply didn't just increase by 10%, it doubled. Mean black earnings in the North in 1940 was $9,000 in today's dollars. there were 1.5 million black men who were at risk of competition, as well as the 2 million new migrants who competed with each other. So I combined both of these into the group of at-risk men who face this form of competition. And on aggregate, this generates a loss of $3 billion. So there was a gain that was larger, but a loss that's in the same order of magnitude, and that's important to consider when we think about the full benefit of the migration. The migrants benefited tremendously, but given the segmentation in the labor market, which I think rolls back to the Southern schoolhouse, there were a whole set of blacks in the North that faced this heightened competition and therefore lower wages going forward. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, because I haven't fully wrapped my head around. So what is the, are you looking at all North lumped together? Are you segmenting it by labor markets? So there's no
all
distinction?
North and West. Everything that's not the Confederate South and then a couple of border states.
So you wouldn't expect that, I mean, some states had more in-migration than others. So do you take a look at whether they suffer more loss? I mean, because you would expect
No.
that, right? Given your
Potentially, but there's also the corresponding outflows of the native-born in response. So now it might be there might be less geographic mobility for the black if blacks are the ones that are facing the competition, and blacks feel tied to particular northern locations because of the locations of enclaves and whatnot. Maybe there's less geographic mobility in this case than there would be for sort of native-born whites today. But I was pretty convinced by the literature from contemporary period that we miss a lot when we use the geographic variation because there's a lot of there's a lot of native outflow in response to a potential migrant competition. So, I mean, even I see this in LA today, that LA was 17% black in 1970, it's now 7% black. And a lot of that is responsive outflow to Hispanic immigration and the potential competition between blacks and Hispanics. So blacks are moving now to Phoenix, Las Vegas, to the Inland Empire, which is a separate metro area, part of Southern California. And so I think there's a lot of potential for inoculating yourself or protecting yourself against immigrant competition through geographic mobility. And I want to shut that down. I want to say you can't leave your skill group. And so that may attenuate your ability to see exactly who's competing with who, but imagine this is one big national market.
But you have their state but wouldn't you know if they're moving in reaction to that?
You can look at that. I mean, you can empirically document that and see how important it is. I haven't done that, but I sort of take the lesson from the contemporary work in sort of motivating this approach, but you could certainly try to validate that and see how important it is. Okay, so I actually turned to a more geographic method to think about the effect of migrant arrivals on cities and housing markets. And the overview of how I see this episode is that white suburbanization was already underway in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s due to rising real incomes in the post-war expansion and new highway construction. So there is good evidence already out there by Bob Margo and Nate Baum-Snow documenting these two components. If you take their estimates and put them on top of each other, they say that they can explain around 75 or 80% of the decline in population in center cities or in the shift out to the suburbs. So there's not a lot of room left over for black migration as a potential cause of suburbanization. But what I find is that suburbanization did hasten this white outflow to the suburbs. And I look at 70 cities across the North and West, essentially all cities outside of the South. And each black arrival, on average, I find is associated with 2 white departures. So 2 white departures is important because if you write down a simple housing market model, which is in the book, and in the paper on which this section of the book is based, so if you're interested, you could check it out already. Any inflow to a city is going to be associated with rising rents in the short run, and therefore some responsive outflow. So simply showing that arrivals generate more than zero outflows is not evidence of white flight as we tend to think of it, or whites responding to the racial composition either of their neighborhood or of the city as a whole. It could just be housing market interactions, and I described for you these transition neighborhoods where blacks are facing limited housing supply, blacks outbid whites for housing in that ring around a black enclave, and whites move either somewhere else in the city or out into the suburbs. And so a simple model would say that each black arrival would generate one out migrant. The fact that we see more than one is suggestive that there's more than just housing market dynamics going on. So let me show you just the simple correlation and some of the facts, and then we'll talk for the last 10, 15 minutes about the motivations of these whites who are leaving. So this is the
Just
data.
to clarify,
Yeah.
Are you going to talk about the labor market implications of?
No. No. And in fact, I think through in the book some of the consequences of these white departures for blacks who remain in the city. Try to aggregate across the potential channels through which people have said white departures can harm existing black workers. Most of that comes actually from sort of me being in touch with the existing literature, not adding that much new material there. But I do add one piece, which is a countervailing positive side to these white departures for blacks, which is that in the long run, as whites leave, we see that there's actually net population loss. Each black arrival is associated with 2 white departures. And so in the long run, you end up having housing price declines in these cities, and that encourages some blacks that are on the margin between home renting and home ownership to shift into home ownership. And so you can document that in places where there was more white suburbanization, there's also an increase in black home ownership rates. And at least from 40 to 80, black-owned property in central cities appreciated at the same level as the national real estate market. From 80 onward, there's been some declines, though perhaps those declines have reversed more recently. So it is one way that blacks can accumulate wealth through home ownership. That's something that is a potential silver lining to white flight, though other people have outlined potential consequences or costs to the black population. So I think one maybe shortcoming right now of how the book's constructed is that this piece of the story doesn't tie back in directly to the accounting of the labor market costs and benefits and costs. So this is data across the 70 cities where I'm just taking out a regional fixed effect and a metro level population growth component, and I'm looking at center cities. So this is the outcome of a regression, and these are the residuals there after the regional fixed effect and the metro growth component. What we see is that cities that had larger inflows of black population relative to trend had more outflows of white population, and vice versa. So this is just the raw correlation across the 70 cities, where if you look at the trend line, that's where you start to see this 2-for-1 departure rate. And then I spent time in the book thinking about causality. So can we confidently say that when we see this negative association, it's because whites leave in response to black arrivals, or might it be that blacks arrive in response to white departures, or in response to some third factor? And there's good reason to think it could go either way. As whites leave, housing prices go down. That makes the location more attractive in terms of cost of living. And there are nice case studies of that going on at the neighborhood level. So in Boston, there's a Jewish population in Dorchester and Roxbury. They move to the suburbs. When blacks arrive, they say, okay, in the city of Boston, that's the neighborhood that they choose, and so on. So we have to think about causality here. And I put together an instrumental variable for black migrant inflows to a center city based on the relationship due to chain migration between particular northern cities and southern states. So if you think about Mississippi versus Alabama, two neighboring cotton states in the South. The vast majority of outflows from Mississippi go to Chicago. The outflows from Alabama are split between Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. Some of that traces back to the initial train infrastructure in the 1910s and 15, that there's really one way out of Mississippi, and that's on the Illinois Central. There are really two ways out of Alabama, and one branches east, one branches west. So you can pick out these strong chain migration relationships between southern states and northern cities. And then you can predict outflows from southern states based on agricultural change. And when you put all of that together, I find a very similar estimate of the relationship between black arrivals and white departures. So I am convinced that this relationship is a causal one, but then the maybe more interesting question is the mechanisms. Is it all housing market? Is it neighborhood? And the other possibility being, is it local public goods at the city level?
Isn't
Yeah.
it the same to do, just put rents, housing rents on that same graph and see what's happening? But if it's a reverse causality story, you should see a positive relationship. If it's the it's the direct effect, you should see a negative relationship. No, other way around.
I see what you're saying, that if it's like blacks are being driven in, are being pulled in because of housing rents, then we should pick that up in the data. I think that that would be quite possible if there were annual data on this. With the decadal data, it's tough because all of these things are moving at the same time. If we have the white departures lowering housing prices, but then blacks moving in response, they're going to bid the housing prices back up. I'm not sure you pick it up in the decadal, but I haven't actually tried it. So I sort of thought through the logic that way, but I haven't actually looked at it in the data.
There was increasing income segregation. Thought about how you parse out a distinct racial component.
Yes, but only on this one margin that I'll talk about now. So this is the last thing I want to talk about, which is breaking up these motivations for white departures. A piece of it we can set aside as housing market. So I said that I sort of go through that in a model and I say, well, around 1-for-1 departure would be what we would expect from the housing market. Now let's go about explaining the other component. Neighborhood racial transition is the piece that people have focused on most readily, particularly coming out of sociology. There's been some work in economics as well. A lot of the sociology work actually originated here at Wisconsin. And clearly that's an important factor. But one thing that puzzled me going into this is the extent of segregation within cities by race. So I'm showing you here, and it's hard to see with the different colors, I think, the city of Chicago in 1940. These dark areas here are already majority black. And then I have rings, dark gray, lighter gray, and white, showing distance of a neighborhood from a majority black area. And on average, around 30% of whites in center cities lived 4 or more miles away from a majority black area. And those neighborhoods on average in 1940 were 2% black. So yes, you could imagine that there's strong concern about neighborhood racial transition in these immediate rings. And indeed, the data would bear that out. So that this first ring here, not just for Chicago, but if you aggregate across all cities and do the same exercise, that first ring of neighborhoods that are just adjacent to a majority black area in 1940 were 9% black in 1940 and became 60% black by 1970. So neighbors there who were concerned about racial transition, were accurately predicting what might happen. And those folks may have moved to the suburbs as a result. But what about these guys? To the extent that these guys are moving to the suburbs, what would their motivation be? And for that, I think about how the city as a whole would change as the city becomes more racially diverse in terms of property taxes, spending priorities, public goods. Now, Steve asked about breaking up race versus income, and I break up race versus income only in this context here. I think about the motivations of people on the edge of cities in these all-white areas, some of whom are leaving. And I put together a data set of border areas where I look at census tract pairs, and I zero in more specifically on census blocks, separated by a city-suburban border. So this is something that people have done in the public and urban literature in the contemporary period to think about the valuation of local public goods. And the outcome of interest is the housing price. So our housing price is a little bit higher on one side of a school attendance zone versus the other within the same public school district. For the parents in the room, you're very aware of which is the good public school, which is the bad public school. And so you see more people moving to one side versus the other. And that's what I'm doing here. I put together a data set of 100 border areas. This is the border areas I have for the city of Chicago. I have 5 in the city of Chicago. The reason why I don't have the entire border is because the suburb has to be large enough, population-wise, to have block-level data available from the census, and that's the big constraint. But I have 100 borders across 30 metro areas, and I show that the neighborhoods are quite similar on both sides of the border, but that the housing prices are higher on the suburban side, and that gap between city and suburb grows as the city becomes more racially diverse, even though very few of these guys are living close to the majority black areas. But then I do the horse race between race and income. And even though I only have 100 borders, I have enough variation to show that on this particular set of concerns, when it comes to the concerns about fiscal and local public goods, income matters more than race. In fact, race sort of disappears once you've properly controlled for income. But race comes back as a consideration from 1970 to 80, after court-ordered desegregation begins in some of these sample cities, but not others. So that is the final piece of the book, and you can see just a couple of the components of the data work here. This is sort of hand-collected block-level data from 1960 to 80 along these borders. I'd love to go back to 40 and 50, but the block data is not there. Where these indexing will tell you how far away from the border is the block. The -1 is the first block on the suburban side. The +1 is the first block on the city side. So you see that comparing city block 1 to 2, there's no difference in housing price, or suburban block 1 to 2. But city block versus suburban block has a 5% difference in housing price, dividing between the racially homogeneous suburb and the racially diverse city. Now, of course, this is rolling in a lot of differences here. Like if you think about the city of Chicago, Evanston was already 16% black, but Oak Park was less than 1% black. So I'm treating Evanston and Oak Park identically here, calling them the suburban side. So I'm missing a lot here. So in the real analysis, I use all the real variation. I show that race matters, but then once you control for median income and poverty, race disappears. On the fiscal considerations, it's income here. I try to figure out, once you get the estimate for the willingness to pay for a 20% increase in the median income of your town, not your local neighbors, but your town. People are willing to pay 5% more to live on the side of the border where their neighbors are 20% richer. That would be, usually on the suburban side. And then I try to get data on effective property tax rate, which is great. There's one survey the Census of Government did. It was in 1972. It's in my sample period. And I can see that property tax matters. My proxy for school quality matters. And then I try other spending categories. And by the time you've looked at property tax rate and school quality, it seems like that sort of does the bulk of the explanation for you. And the final thing I do is I say, what about after school desegregation comes in? Some of the cities in my sample faced court-ordered school desegregation, some did not. You already see that those who faced school desegregation, the city-suburban price gap was already larger in 70 before school desegregation began. So there's something a little different about those cities relative to the gray bars where the city did not face school desegregation. But from 70 to 80, when the court cases came in, and they weren't anticipated in 70 because there was a 73 Supreme Court case that basically put the North on the hook for school desegregation. Before that, the idea was you had to have actively taken steps and explicitly had separate black and white schools. And then in the 73 Keyes decision, broadened out to other types of school district decisions. And the gap between city and suburb grows tremendously from around a 5% price gap to a 10% price gap in the areas where school desegregation hits, but not in the areas where school desegregation does not happen over that decade. So you can really pick up a response to school desegregation here that brings race back into the story. So I will stop there. The book tries to put the housing market, neighborhood, and fiscal, local, public good stuff all together to put together a full decomposition of why whites leave in response to black arrivals. And those three components do tell the story. So broadly speaking, whites leave for the suburbs because of income, highways, and race. And then within race, we can understand now some of the motivations of these departures. Thank you so much for your attention. And I believe this is when I'm supposed to end, right? Is that right? Okay. So I believe I may even be a minute or two over. So I thank you for your questions and your attention.